On this Wednesday night, both Israel and Hamas accused of war crimes. New findings from a UN inquiry with peace talks in a stalemate.
It's frustrating a lot of times.
Russian warships sailed to Cuba, the message it sends, and why Washington says it's not worried. An innovative weapon to fight wildfires.
Yes, you could eat it.
The Made in Canada solution containing no toxic chemicals. And one of Canada's most compelling maritime mysteries finally solved.
We found the quest.
All right.
The discovery of Sir Ernest Shackleton's last ship.
Global National with Donna Friesen. Reporting tonight, Chris Galis.
Good evening. Thanks very much for joining us. More allegations tonight of war crimes against both Israel and Hamas. An inquiry commissioned by the United Nations finds both sides committed grave violations of international law. And right now, the U.S., Egypt, and Qatar are trying to push through a revised ceasefire plan that's still getting resistance.
Our biggest concern is that it's taking too long to bridge these gaps. We need to get this to an end as soon as possible.
Redmond Shannon has our top story tonight, and a warning: this report contains disturbing images.
The U.S. Secretary of State's 8th Middle East trip in 8 months. The latest collective push by Washington, Qatar and Egypt to end the misery and death in Gaza. Hamas finally formally responding to the three-stage peace plan tentatively backed by Israel.
Hamas has proposed numerous changes to the proposal that was on the table. We discussed those changes last night with Egyptian colleagues and today with the Prime Minister. Some of the changes are workable, some are not.
Any hope of an imminent truce remains faint.
It's frustrating, the behavior from both parties, different occasions, being counterproductive to the efforts.
The sticking point likely Hamas's desire that Israeli troops withdraw permanently from Gaza, something Israeli leader Benjamin Netanyahu says he will not consider until Hamas is eliminated. Leaders on both sides already face international arrest warrants for their respective actions in the war. And on Wednesday, a further damning assessment. A United Nations commissioned inquiry finding both sides committed war crimes. The report said Israeli civilians were intentionally targeted by Palestinian militants. That, as well as children being killed and injured, many witnessed the killing of their parents and siblings. It also accused the Hamas-led attackers of committing sexual and gender-based violence in similar ways in several locations. The UN report says in the 3 months after October 7th, Israeli actions amounted to war crimes and crimes against humanity, accusing Israel of intentionally directing attacks against civilians, using starvation as a method of warfare, and accusing Israeli forces of sexual humiliation and harassment.
Israel does not recognize the inquiry commission and has rejected its findings. The report said Israel obstructed the work of the investigators. The findings do not come with a punishment, but they could be used in the active international court cases relating to the war. Chris?
Redmond Shannon in London, thank you. Well, despite hope for peace, there was a major attack on Israel from inside Lebanon today. Israel says it intercepted hundreds of rockets fired hours after Israeli airstrikes killed a Hezbollah militant commander. Hezbollah is vowing to increase its operations against Israel. The conflict in the Middle East is expected to be addressed at the G7 summit in Italy. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has arrived in the country. He is there along with other leaders from the world's most developed countries. Mackenzie Gray is traveling with the Prime Minister and looks at what else is on the agenda.
The final preparations coming together in Italy for the G7, where two wars are set to dominate the agenda.
In the days ahead, we are going to continue to push on an urgent basis with our partners, with Qatar, with Egypt, to try to close this deal.
Finding a solution for Gaza the main topic, with the group of advanced economies having already endorsed an American ceasefire plan. But Israel has not publicly backed the deal, and Hamas has rejected portions of it, keeping not only the ceasefire talks, but the future of Palestinian statehood at the top of the agenda.
Does all the G7 believe in a two-state solution? How do we get from here to there? That would mean reconstruction of Gaza.
Rebuilding Ukraine and the money to make it happen likely to be the most tangible announcement from the summit. The cash coming from frozen Russian assets in Western countries, an idea championed by Canada. But the debate between the leaders will be on how far to go.
I hope as a very minimum at the G7 this week, we can agree that we use the interest from the frozen assets to roll up an enormous loan for Ukraine, and the money can flow way before we get elections in America in November.
It's not just the U.S. election. Recent voting for new members of the European Parliament, the current British election, and a snap vote called by French President Emmanuel Macron, all contributing to uncertainty about the players at the table going forward. But it would be the return of Donald Trump that would shake things up the most.
There's some anxiety about the upcoming election and what that means. That may not be directly on the agenda, but boy, I think everybody's going to be talking about that behind the scenes and in all the bilateral meetings.
The Prime Minister, who's the longest-serving leader in the G7, will also likely be thinking about his priorities for next year, Chris, when Canada hosts the G7.
Mackenzie Gray in Bari, Italy. Thanks, Mackenzie. French President Emmanuel Macron is defending his decision to call a snap election after his party's crushing defeat in the European parliamentary vote. In his first public address since the surprise move, he said he couldn't ignore France's new political reality. He urged all politicians to regroup and defeat the far right in upcoming elections. He said he would not resign if his party loses. And France is suspending controversial voting reforms in New Caledonia. The planned changes triggered deadly civil unrest, and at least 9 people were killed. The reforms would have extended the right to vote to residents who have lived in the territory for at least 10 years. A Russian missile strike in southern Ukraine has killed at least 9 people and injured nearly 30 others. Ukrainian officials say Russian forces launched aerial attacks in 6 regions of the country today, with the hardest hit being President Volodymyr Zelensky's hometown of Kryvyi Rih. They say Ukraine's Air Force shot down more than 24 missiles and drones. The latest attacks come as residents deal with rolling blackouts of up to 8 hours. Ukraine is grappling with severe damage to its power stations due to earlier bombardments. Russia's military is also making headlines in the Caribbean. A fleet of naval warships arrived in Cuba today for what's being described as a diplomatic 5-day visit. At one point in history, this would have been considered a major provocation. But as Jackson Proskow reports, Washington doesn't consider the move a threat to the U.S.
It's not the first time Russia's Navy has sailed to Havana. At this tense moment between Moscow and the West, Russian warships and a nuclear submarine on America's doorstep send an unmistakable message.
The visiting Russian warships to Cuba are Vladimir Putin's way of reminding President Biden that Moscow can challenge Washington in its own sphere of influence, too.
The ships arrived after days of high-precision missile training in the Atlantic. Russia's defense ministry says the vessels are not carrying nuclear weapons, but are loaded with hypersonic missiles. All of it coincides with a visit by Cuba's foreign minister to Moscow.
We will see how this unfolds in the coming days, but we have seen this kind of thing before, and we expect to see this kind of thing again.
The U.S. insists the Russian visit to Cuba is routine and does not represent an escalation.
It's an explicit threat to the peace and security of all the Americas.
A far cry from the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, which entrenched fears of a Soviet attack launched from the island. These days, Cuba is more interested in an economic lifeline and is even trying to woo Russian tourists.
Russia is the only country that has been willing to provide significant help, just as it did during the Soviet era.
Russia isn't the only country looking to win hearts in Havana. The Royal Canadian Navy announced one of its newest patrol vessels, HMCS Margaret Brooke, will visit this weekend in recognition of the long-standing bilateral relationship between Canada and Cuba. a sign this tiny nation still plays a major role at a time of global instability. Jackson Proskow, Global News, Washington.
An update tonight on the investigation into a deadly wrong-way pursuit on a busy Ontario highway. The chase in April ended in a deadly crash that killed 4 people, including a baby and his grandparents. Police have been criticized for pursuing the suspect, and now the province's police watchdog says 2 of the officers involved have not agreed to be interviewed. Sean O'Shea reports.
This was a collision on Highway 401 east of Toronto in Whitby on April 29th, the aftermath of a high-speed chase that took 4 lives and left 2 others seriously injured. It began with a call about a possible robbery at this liquor store and led to this. Police pursuing a cargo van at high speed through residential areas. A chase that would lead to a stretch of Canada's busiest highway, with the driver of the van and police going the wrong way into traffic. An Ontario Provincial Police radio call makes clear that this was extremely risky.
If we can pass on, just want to make sure the Durham sergeant's aware that they're driving the opposite direction. Someone's going to get hurt.
A 3-month-old boy and his grandparents were killed, along with the driver of the van. Ontario's Special Investigations Unit, in charge of investigating the crash, hasn't been able to talk to the Durham officers involved in that pursuit. Even though they've now seized or obtained 100 videos, including those from police body-worn cameras and in-car cameras, they've spoken to 36 civilian witnesses, they've talked to at least some of 19 witness officials. But as for those 2 Durham police officers in the pursuit, neither has turned over their notes or consented to an interview, which is their right.
And that's very similar to any suspect in any criminal investigation, a police officer or not. Nobody's compelled to provide a statement if they choose not to do so.
The agency told Global News officers are invited but not compelled to be interviewed, saying once they become the focus of an investigation, they're granted the same rights as anyone else under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Of the 2 who were seriously injured in the crash, 1 has now been released from hospital. By law, the SIU has 120 days after a police-involved incident to conduct an investigation.
They have to decide whether there's reasonable grounds to lay criminal charges against any of the officers who are involved.
So far, no charges have been laid. Sean O'Shea, Global News, Toronto.
Fire suppression with a special ingredient. Coming up, the new non-toxic solution to douse wildfires. Summer arrives officially next week, and it's already been an active wildfire season in some parts of the country. With more than 15 million hectares burned last year, a Canadian company has come up with what it believes is a better non-toxic solution to douse the flames. And as Jeff Semple shows us, it's practically edible.
Here we go again. After last year's worst wildfire season on record. Fire crews are bracing for another fight, but this time they have a new weapon. This water is mixed with a product called Eco-Gel, a made-in-Ontario innovation that essentially fights fires with salad.
100% plant-based. So it's made with common food ingredients, which you've probably eaten most of our ingredients over the course of a week.
This veteran volunteer firefighter who founded the company says most of their ingredients are grown on Canadian farms.
Yeah, you can dip your finger in.
That vegetable oil is then mixed with gums, starches, and water, creating a honey-like texture. Can you eat it?
Yes, you could eat it. No, it wouldn't taste any good at all. But it is, totally environmentally benign.
Eco-Gel essentially makes water sticky, smothering the fire and preventing it from spreading any further. And crucially, it does that without using chemicals. Many fire retardants and foams traditionally used against wildfires contain a toxic cocktail.
The biggest issue is their persistence, right? They hang around in the environment.
This environmental toxicologist tested the toxicity of several fire-suppressing products and found Eco-Gel was the least toxic.
We're likely going to see more use of these different firefighting water additives. Wouldn't we want to go with the one that poses the least risk to human health and to the environment?
Eco-Gel flows with water, then becomes sticky and thick, creating a protective coating that can last for days.
I believe it is a game changer.
This contractor just sprayed more than 100,000 liters of EcoGel solution on rail lines and bridges around Fort Nelson, BC. It's also been used to protect homes.
We can use lots of it without harming the environment, and we can create better fire breaks. I believe we can protect these assets.
Fire departments from more than 20 municipalities are now using EcoGel, and it's also being considered for use by the military, First Nations, and federal government. A first-of-its-kind Canadian-made gel that could change the way we fight fires. Jeff Semple, Global News, Borden, Ontario.
In the U.S., parts of Florida are underwater tonight after a torrential rainstorm brought record-breaking downpours in the southern part of the state. For the second straight day, more than 10 centimeters of rain fell in just a few hours, triggering flash floods in several municipalities. The relentless rain creates dangerous conditions on roads, even stranding some drivers. Hundreds of flight delays and cancellations have also been reported. Flood threats and scattered storms are expected to last throughout the week and into the weekend. The loss of the logo. Ahead, how superstar Jerry West became an NBA legend on and off the court. The sporting world lost a legend today. Three-time Basketball Hall of Famer Jerry West has died. As a player, West was a 14-time All-Star, an NBA champion, and it's his image that's the silhouette for the league's logo. Yet he might have been even more legendary in the front office. West won 8 championships as an executive for the LA Lakers and Golden State Warriors, helping build multiple dynasties along the way. Jerry West was 86 years old. A warning tonight for lovers of spicy food. Denmark has recalled 3 instant noodle products over concerns they could poison consumers. The recall is for 3 flavors: Samyang Buldak Hot Chicken Ramen 3 times spicy, Buldak Hot Chicken Ramen 2 times spicy, and Hot Chicken Stew. At least 2 of those flavors are sold in Canada. Danish authorities say the issue is the level of capsaicin, a spicy, naturally occurring chemical found in chili peppers. The noodles are believed to have a Scoville rating, the scale used to measure spiciness, of around 13,000. For context, the popular hot sauce sriracha clocks in around 2,200. And some big news from the world of competitive eating. Its most famous champion will not be part of its most famous event this year. Major League Eating, yes, that's a thing, has announced Joey Chestnut is banned from the annual Nathan's Famous Hot Dog Eating Contest. The 16-time winner recently agreed to represent Impossible Foods, a vegan company that's a competitor of Nathan's. Chestnut says he's gutted about the decision. The league says he can compete in future contests if he ditches his sponsorship deal. No longer lost at sea. Next, how explorers found Ernest Shackleton's last ship off Canada's Atlantic coast. "53 years after a plane carrying 5 men disappeared in the U.S., searchers believe they've found the wreckage. It was discovered by underwater experts in Vermont's Lake Champlain, close to where the private jet was last tracked before it vanished in 1971. The team used sonar imaging to confirm the plane's custom paint matched the long-lost jet. Victims' families say they finally have closure.
We always knew the reality, but now the reality is here. And it's difficult, and it's very sad.
The plane went missing on a snowy night shortly after takeoff. 17 separate attempts to find it failed. A major maritime mystery has been solved in Canada. The last ship used by legendary polar explorer Sir Ernest Shackleton has been found off the coast of Labrador more than 60 years after it sank. Finding the vessel Quest has long been a dream for a team of modern-day explorers determined to find the vessel's final resting place. Heidi Petracek breaks down how they did it and what this means for Shackleton's legacy.
That's it. I think we got it. Are you serious? Well done. That's what I thought.
This is the moment the crew of the Shackleton Quest expedition found the famed explorer's last vessel in its final resting place.
We found the Quest. All right!
After a 4-day mission, sonar showed it on the floor of the Labrador Sea, 390 meters underwater. The team, led by the Royal Canadian Geographical Society, revealed the details back on shore.
It's roughly where in waters that he would have passed had he succeeded in his dream of a Canadian Arctic expedition. It's somehow fitting that it should end here.
The crew departed St. John's June 5th and headed north for a search area off the coast of Labrador, where the Quest was eventually found on June 9th. But it wasn't easy. The mission was plagued with mechanical issues.
No, I'm not happy. We're wasting hours here.
With just 6 hours left before the search window would close, the breakthrough was made, and the news shared with Sir Ernest Shackleton's granddaughter.
Well, I'm delighted. Warmest congratulations to you all.
Back in 1920, Sir Ernest Shackleton had intended to take the Quest to explore the Canadian Arctic, but federal government support fell through. So he took it to Antarctica in 1922, but en route, he died of a heart attack at just 47 years old. The Quest was eventually transferred to Norwegian sealers and in 1962 hit ice and sank. For the son-in-law of its last owner, locating the ship became a lifelong pursuit.
I've always had a dream about that. During the expeditions I have been through, that one day this would be possible.
Norwegian experts helped translate the captain's log and other documents to help determine the best place to look.
It is as accurate as it could be from the equipment they had at the time. It's only about a mile or so, nautical mile, from the exact position.
2 years ago, another Shackleton vessel, the Endurance, was found off Antarctica a century after it sank. Underwater images of its remains continue to captivate enthusiasts. The crew of this expedition intends to gather the same kind of images on a return trip to the Quest.
The whole idea of uncovering this history is to be able to tell it again to a new generation. His Shackleton's experience in Antarctica is timeless. We'll be talking about it for another 100 years.
For historians, the sinking of the Quest has symbolized the end of an heroic age of polar exploration. Finding it is now a new chapter in this contemporary story of discovery. Heidi Petracek, Global News, Halifax.
And that is Global National for this Wednesday. I'm Chris Galis. Tonight's Your Canada, fittingly, icebergs off the coast of St. Anthony, Newfoundland and Labrador. Thanks very much for watching. Have a great evening.